who do we come from? Given all of our cultural and physical and linguistic differences, how do we connect to one another? Creationists might say we all separated at Babel, but how step by step did we get here? And to this day, we still naturally, because we're sinners, look at people who are different than us and say foreign or separate or racist views of one another. And this is one of the ways that we're uncovering the connections among us, and they're much more surprising than we think. And it's not just modern people, it's looking at the ancients as well. I grew up with the default assumption that being of half German descent, and then that's my mother's side, and my dad's side being American for many generations, but likely back to Europe. These other cultures that are not Central Europe, so Greeks are Southern Europe, of course, or not European at all, the African Egyptians, the Iranian Persians, none of these must be connected to me. They're elsewhere in the globe. Well, we're finding out that these stereotypes that I grew up with, that perhaps you grew up with, are turning out to be wrong. And I've promised there's some shocking conclusions we're going to reach in this series. Those second and third points we've already begun to uncover. We've seen that most Europeans have recent Asian ancestry. We've seen that nationalities disappear, German, French, British, these go away. We're eventually going to see that so-called black-white people exist. Dark-skinned, I should say light-skinned people, Caucasians walking around who've had African ancestors for thousands of years. None of this we'd ever expected without these tools of genetics. We've seen that the Americas have been resettled at least once, and eventually we're going to get to the most ancient history, the Neanderthals, and figure out how they fit into this equation and whether or not the mainstream narrative and explanation for their origins and migration fits the data. And my overall goal is not just apologetic, not just challenging someone's view if you don't agree with what the scriptures say, but that we'd all marvel at who we came from, our own stories, in a way we've never done so before. We've begun to marvel at the story of the Native Americans. We've seen over previous episodes that today's Native Americans are not the first Americans. They came over to the Americas in the AD era and perhaps mixed with, or maybe more likely, wiped out whoever was here first. And this unprecedented discovery about the world raises a whole bunch of new questions that are begging for answers. Why did they leave Central Asia? What is their story? What pushed them across the Bering Strait? What happened after they arrived in the Americas, and who were the first Americans? What I'm going to look at today, though, is the question of why did today's Native Americans leave Central Asia? This is not something in mainstream science many people think about, because they push off this particular event into the realm of prehistory, 15,000 years ago. Well, this anchors it firmly in recorded history, and so what historical events might this be tied to? And to think about why Native Americans would leave Central Asia, let's deal with something more familiar. Let's think in today's terms why people might leave ancestral homelands. And there's many often sad examples we can think of in today's world. What comes to my mind is the refugee crisis, ongoing refugee crisis in Syria. There's millions of people who have been displaced, including children. Why? Because of massive civil war that's going on, basically civil unrest. And how many examples can we think of from history of civil unrest forcing people out, fleeing, seeking refugee status in other countries? That's one potential explanation for why people leave where they were originally from. It doesn't have to be necessarily that extreme, though. Thinking of the history of the United States, people came over from Great Britain, from Europe, settled on the East Coast, and then eventually started moving west. Why would they leave the East Coast and pick up and try to start a new life further west? Economic opportunity, another major theme in migrations and human history. But you think back to the earliest stages of the United States, the coming of the Pilgrims, their motive, their purpose in coming over was to flee religious persecution. So the seeking of religious freedom is yet another motivation, another purpose in leaving. And these don't need to be distinct. They can all be overlapping and simultaneous when people leave wherever they're from. Could any of these explanations have applied historically to this question of today's Native Americans? Is there anything in history that might indicate and give us a clue as to why these people in the early AD era left their ancestral homelands in Asia and came across the Bering Strait? Well, in the era of 250 to 800 AD, there's something very significant happening in Europe. Around the time of Christ, AD 1, AD 30, it was the Roman Empire that was ruling much of Europe. And around the 400s, 500s AD, after the Western and Eastern Roman Empires split up, the Western Roman Empire fell due to invasions from so-called Germanic barbarians. Some of these appear to be indigenous Europeans. We'll discuss them more when we talk about what happened to the Vikings in a future episode. But some of them were Central Asian, like the Huns, shown here by this green arrow. So on the other side of the map, the western side of the map, there was tremendous civil unrest, invasions, warfare happening in the Roman Empire. So that's what's happening on the left side. On the right side of the map, the Asian side of the map, you might recall from episode 9 when we discussed Chinese history, that we can summarize East Asian history, at least Chinese history, by a long series of Chinese dynasties that undergo periodic interruptions, usually due to invaders from the north. They're protected geographically in the west, the south, the east. It's the north where they build the Great Wall to try to keep these people out. Well, they can breach these defenses occasionally. And one of the major episodes, which at least one history book calls the Age of Division, happens exactly during this time period. The end of it is the Han Dynasty, around 200 to 20 AD. And there's all sorts of unrest then in China, division, so forth. There's barbarians who rule in northern China, and they don't get thrown out until the late 500s, early 600s AD by the Sui dynasty. So it's the Han Dynasty that's ruling China around the time of Christ, sort of contemporary with the Roman Empire at times. They fall, lots of division ensues. You have northern barbarian tribes like the Shanbai who are ruling up here and don't get thrown out till late 500s, 600s. And we discussed this when we talked about the ancient Chinese connection to modern Europe. It's this particular branch, this group on the tree that we call Group N, that shows this connection. Well, that's very intriguing. Around the same time that the Native Americans, today's Native Americans, are leaving Asia, you have tremendous upheaval and civil unrest in Asia. And in fact, because you have unrest all across the Asian continent, from Europe, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, this period of history has been given its own name, and the German name they came up with was the Völkerwanderung, or in English, the Great Wandering of Peoples, because there's so much activity in Central Asia, so much movement east and west. This is a massive transition period. So is it any surprise that we have not only movements within Asia, but from Asia out into an entirely different continent? So this is an intriguing handle that begs for further explanation. The next steps here would be for someone who can read Chinese, I cannot, to take a deep dive into the historical literature. The smoking gun that would give us an even greater clue into the story of the Native Americans would be finding some sort of historical record that says, these people were living over here, they were doing this, and then they disappeared and we never heard from them again. That's the type of thing I'm expecting to be able to find in the historical records in ancient Chinese literature or the literature of others around that time period. Perhaps we could also find the answer as we take a deeper dive into the oral and written histories of the Native Americans. I'm concluding right here without a great resolution because this is research in progress and this is begging for a multidisciplinary, multi-person investigation. I'm a geneticist by training. Some of our viewers might know people who are historians. This is groundbreaking research that no one's ever considered. No one's taken this approach to take a deep dive into this period of history to say, what was going on, and can we start putting the pieces together to solve this puzzle of Native American history and move it from the realm of prehistory into the historical era where we have written records and such that can tell us what happened. Well, that's one field of science we can turn to try to expand the story of today's Native Americans. I want to turn to another discipline of science that also holds some tantalizing clues, and that's the discipline of linguistics. So for example, if you compare basic words that pretty much every language needs, and I'm going to compare them in German and English, you see some similarities. So everyone has a father, a mother, everyone's born, they live. You need to have these sorts of words in virtually every language. So let's compare English and the German. Notice that in English we say father. In German it's spelled with a V, but it's pronounced the same letter is still that F sound, Vater. Mother, Mutter, you can see the similarities again with the first letter pronunciation. Born, geboren. In German the emphasis is still on the B, the second syllable. Life, Leben, you can see there's obvious parallels between these two. The parallels aren't as strong between English and Spanish. So father doesn't have a F sound, it has a P sound in Spanish, padre. Mother still has the M, retains the M, madre. Born, though, you can see the differences are more striking. Nacido, and life has a vida beginning, doesn't have the L sound. Spanish and Latin, though, seem to be about as similar as English and German both have the P for father. Padre, pater, madre, mater, naciado, natus. You can see those parallels there between Spanish and Latin. And if we didn't know any better, looking at these similarities and differences, we might be tempted to say perhaps there's a relationship among these languages. Perhaps English and German come from a common ancestral language. Perhaps Spanish and Latin come from a common ancestral language. And if we think about it deeper and further, maybe both of these groups share a common ancestor in the distant past. And if you're watching, you might say, whoa, 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 whoa. You're talking about language evolution? Well, no, but I'm talking about something that might be familiar, especially to those who have been watching and are familiar with the concept of kinds. So let's think about this from a biblical perspective. Genesis 10 and especially Genesis 11 talk about the origin of languages. God says and writes in Genesis 11 that the whole earth was one speech, one language, and because mankind rebelled and refused to obey the command to spread out as God told them to, instead they built a tower to heaven, God says and forces them to spread out by confusing their languages. Genesis 10 gives us a list of about 70 or so men and says, by these, their families were divided, the nations were divided. And so I'm going to go with the idea that Genesis 10 gives us the family groups of those who were divided at that time in history. There's the entire planet shortly after the flood. Now today, the number of languages is not 70. The number of languages is in excess of 7,000. So how in the world to make sense of that? Well, if the language division that happened in Babel continued to produce more and more languages, that's how you explain it. So I would argue there's a biblical precedent for looking at this. And the parallel that I see is to the concept of kind. So for years now, creationists have talked about the kind that God creates in Genesis chapter 1. It's not the same thing as species. God doesn't create a whole bunch of species. He doesn't create millions of species in the beginning. He creates kinds. And from these kinds, new species have formed. And fast forwarding to the time of the flood, Noah takes two of every kind. He doesn't take two house cats and two lions and two tigers. They're all part of the same family, even though they're separate species. Noah takes two felids on board the ark, and after the flood, the 30-plus species of cats, large and small, are formed. There's limits to that, but speciation happens. In a similar way, I argue that there's limits to the amount of language change that can happen, but from these 70 initial kinds, perhaps, of languages, to use that term, families of languages, many languages have formed since then. So I would argue there's a biblical basis for exploring possible relationships among these particular languages. And one of the most useful tools of classification, perhaps ironically, in linguistics, there's the concept of language families. And in biological classification, if you've read our literature and listened to our talks, you know that in the realm of classifying animal species, it's the level not of species or genus, but of family. That seems to be the best rule of thumb for approximating what these kinds are. Well, lo and behold, if you look at family, something very intriguing emerges in the field of linguistics. So the languages we just discussed are part of a larger Indo-European family. Notice here in red, English, so British Isles and such, are the same color as German languages, Germanic languages, German, Icelandic, Scandinavian ones. You notice that Spanish, Italian, Latin, French, Portuguese, Romanian are all in this tan color. They're Romance languages. The green ones are Slavic languages. You've got Indic languages, Sanskrit and such over here. All of these colors together represent not several, but one language family, the Indo-European family. There's several hundred languages in the Indo-European family. The colors represent subdivisions within it. In Asia, there are also several language families. This represents a single language family, and the colors represent branches within it. This is the Sino-Tibetan language family. Chinese is one subdivision. You've got Tibetan languages, Burmese languages, and so forth. There's multiple language families. As this larger map of Asia indicates, you've got Arabian languages, the Afro-Asiatic ones, Arabic and such. We've got Austronesian ones, which we'll discuss in a future episode. Here you've got the Sino-Tibetan ones broken up into their subdivisions. This is the basic unit that collects languages into a larger grouping. And the reason I bring it up is because when you look at the number of families that exist today, or to phrase it differently, if you were looking at this question and you say, okay, there's 70 families, 70 language units that are listed in Genesis 10, yet there's 100 times that number of languages today, what might be a good approximation for what those original units were? Well, lo and behold, you crack open a linguistics book, like one that the ethnologue, which comes from the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is affiliated with the Wycliffe Bible translators. And if you know anything about missions, there's obviously a strong interest in knowing the languages of the world so we can translate the Bible into those languages. Well, here's linguists, biblical linguists, taking the lead. It's viewed as a very scholarly resource. They list, lo and behold, 163 language families. So from my perspective, here we've got thousands of languages alive today coming biblically from just 70 units, and the number of families is only twice the number of men. So if you know nothing else and you say, whoa, there's only twice the number of families as men, this is a good place to start. That seems to be pretty close to the number of men in Genesis 10, and just a little bit of investigation further might bring that number down. Well, I bring all this up because this is a potential tool then by which to understand the history of the Americas. There's history that's recorded in linguistics. For example, Africa, let's get ourselves oriented to this map. Africa doesn't have that many colors shown here. In this orangish color, you've got Afro-Asiatic family, the Nilo-Saharan family right here, which extends down to the Maasai of Kenya. In green, you have much of West Africa and Central Africa, part of the Niger-Congo family. You've got Click languages here in this sort of a lime green. They're the Click speakers of Southwest Africa. You've got this lighter green color that's Indo-European, same language family as Europe and the Americas. Here the subdivisions are not shown, just one broad light green color. So everything from Germanic and Romance and Slavic are all included. And the Americas, of course, are dominantly this light green because English is the primary language in the US, Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America. Well, I say there's history here because think about the distribution of these Afro-Asiatic languages, of which Arabic is one of them. Well, if you know anything about the history of the conquests due to Islam, they're in the Arabian Peninsula and much of North Africa. So that fits the history. And of course, the reason we have so many Indo-European languages in the Americas is because European colonists came over here. There's history that's recorded. Well, notice here in the Americas, it may be a little bit hard to see because these groupings are so tiny. The Americas are pockmarked with all sorts of different colors. That's because there are an enormous number of language families still up and down the Americas, North America to South America. Not nearly as many as the number of colors you have, let's say, in Africa. So let's think about this more. There's a hint of something here that I want us to notice. Let's begin, though, by looking at the number of languages in total by continent. Here's the Americas combined, their languages. Here's the number of languages in Africa. Again, I've combined Europe and Asia to the Eurasian languages, just because there's a lot of overlap between the two. And then the languages of Oceania, Papua New Guinea, Australia, the Pacific, and so forth. What I want you to see here is that there's a fairly decent balance by continent or by groups of continents. They're all fairly close to each other. Eurasia has 2,400 languages, Africa close to that, about 2,000. Oceania has half that, but it's pretty close in terms of multiplication. And the Americas have the lowest number of languages. But they're all not very far apart. And I bring that up because when you look at the number of families, that's where you really see some skewing. In Africa, as we've seen, there's hardly any language families. There's 8 here by the ethnologue count, and I'm removing obscure things like sign languages and Creoles and so forth. In Eurasia, you have 37, Oceania 26, so here there's a similarity. Well, in the Americas, there's 83. And what really makes this stand out is if we think of the number of families relative to the number of languages. I'm going to draw boxes appropriate to that. Here's where the Americas stick out like a sore thumb. They have a huge number of families per language. In other words, they've got few languages, many families. Africa is the opposite. Many, many languages, very few families. And there's a little bit more balance in Eurasia and Oceania. Why does this stick out so much? There's something about the Americas that seems to be off. It's something different. It's obviously an outlier, as if there's perhaps too many families. And here, again, an analogy to the biological world is helpful. If you've ever studied biological classification, you may have heard the term lumpers and splitters, referring to the tendency among biologists to either group new potential species into pre-existing groups. Those are the lumpers. Oh, here's a different kind of animal. Well, let's just put it in the same species. Versus the splitters who see something different. And every tiny detail, oh, we have to call it a new species. Those are trends in the biological world. You look here in the linguistic world, and it seems like perhaps whoever's in charge of doing the linguistic classification in the Americas is a little bit too much of a splitter. They want to keep dividing into separate language families. It doesn't fit sort of the pattern in the rest of the world. What we see here is consistent with what we have observed visually in this global slide. So let's try to think about the question of why there are so many families in the Americas and why they're grouped into such tiny subcategories. Well, we saw in previous episodes that current archaeological research and historical research is indicating there are massive numbers of people here in the Americas on the eve of Columbus's arrival, far more than we previously thought, perhaps 50 million, which is close to the population of Europe at that time. This is North, Central, and South America combined. Yet within a few hundred years, that population of indigenous peoples dropped to under 10 million. Massive population collapse. Episode 12, we saw the genetic smoking gun of this, the flatlining in the population growth curves. You'll have to see the episode for why that exists. So why do I even bring that up? Well, how many languages have been lost due to the extinction of perhaps 90% of the people who were here prior? Think about it this way. Again, an analogy to the biological world. Today, we group the cat species together. They're all part of one family. And we call them the same kind because of the breeding compatibility. It's not that a lion and a house cat can breed, but a small cat can breed with a slightly larger cat. And then you can connect them up to the largest cats in a reproductive continuum. Well, what if there was a massive population die-off among cats? Let's say there was some feline virus that spreads around the globe and wipes out and decimates the cat population, so that at the end of it, the only species that survive are the lion and the house cat, who cannot interbreed. And they're also very different. They're different in size, they're different in appearance. Would we look at those two survivors and even put them in the same family? I'm going to guess that we probably put them in separate families because of how different they look. So could it be that people have divvied up all these languages in the Americas into separate families because we've lost so many of the languages that used to exist that might make it easier to connect these languages to one another? Another reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a linguist named Joseph Greenberg who's done an analysis of the language families in the Americas. Greenberg is known for, and his classification of the language families in Africa has been accepted. So he's combined so many languages into just a few language families in Africa, and that's mainstream linguistic view. He's done something similar in the Americas as well. Looking at the data, he's argued that there shouldn't be 83 families in the Americas. He's argued for just 3. And one of the reasons I find this interesting, not only because obviously the Americas are an outlier if you look at the rest of the globe, but if you take his numbers at face value and look at the larger picture, that would drop the total number of language families from 163 down to 83, which is much closer to the number of language families that Genesis 10 implies. Now, his view is currently rejected by the linguistics community. What the linguistics community says is not that they think there should be a whole bunch of language families. The mainstream linguistics community will say, we are very comfortable with reducing the number of language families. We also think there's a whole bunch of them, and they'll probably eventually be reduced to just a handful, maybe even one, but we don't think he's made the case well enough yet. So if we eventually go down that road, and linguistics take a good look at this again, especially in light of the genetics that we've just done. And if you look at mainstream linguistics literature, they'll talk about, well, here's how we classify things. Are there any clues in genetics? Any clues in archaeology? Well, now we've got this massive new discovery in genetics. This should prompt a reanalysis of the linguistics field. And I'm suspicious that we'll find some new clues and perhaps connections to Asia that might help narrow down who exactly these people came from and add to the history that we're discovering. What about genetics, though? Third field of science. We looked at history, we looked at language. Are there any additional clues we could glean from genetics? And I want to return to a study that we've talked about many times before. Here are in gray the today's Native Americans. This is where they branch off in the early AD era from other groups. And who are the other groups? Well, here it's in pink, Eskimos, Cats, Selkups. In pink is Siberian groups. They sampled from far northeast Asia. And here in light green, you have a Central Asian individual, Uzbek, from Uzbekistan. So if we go back to our map, this indicates that the most recent relatives of these people are found among these groups. Well, which of these groups might it be? We've run into a problem like this before when talking about the Central Asian connection among Europeans. And one of the challenges that we've seen is that Central Asia, Siberia, represents, or that land, I should say, represents very poor agricultural potential. Historically, these people have been nomadic. They're famous for their horses. The horse and military skill of the Mongols, of course, is famous and led to their world conquest. But that also means they're highly intermixed. Genghis Khan deliberately split up the peoples he conquered, moved them into his army, and divided out peoples of one ethnic groups to break up their loyalties, potential loyalties to in ethnicity, and force their loyalties to a leader, namely him. So there's some sort of connection here, and the way we would dig into this connection further is by going back to Siberia, Central Asia, and getting more DNA sequences to figure and to map out the history to see if we can narrow down who exactly this is. But this is not where we have to stop. This is not yet another place where it's, okay, this is really tantalizing, really interesting, and we're almost there. There's another clue we can glean here that puts the Native American history in a dramatically new context. So yes, we've looked at this question of who are the Central Asian ancestors before, specifically in the context of Europe, trying to understand the branch we called R1B in episode 10. We saw that there's been a stream of Central Asian migrations into Europe and eventually came to dominate Western Europe. And I've said there's a Central Asian Siberian connection to Native America. So that parallel between these two continents is not just a conceptual one. There's a link here that runs much deeper. And I want us to think again about Custer's last stand, an episode in U.S. history that we mentioned in a previous episode. He died June 25th, 1876, along with many of his men, when engaged with a group of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. And historically, we've grown up with this idea that here are two long-separated, long-standing cultures that clashed, and one dominated the other. We've seen from mainstream archaeology how many of our long-standing notions about who the Native Americans were have changed. These Siouan and Cheyenne peoples are the last remnant survivors of a massive population die-off and of a culture that collapsed, that was highly advanced. But who were they? When Custer engaged these people, who was it that was engaging on the battlefield that day? Well, let's revisit this in light of the genetics that we've discussed. In episode 10, we looked at people like Custer, the European Americans, who are the dominant people group in the Americas today, at least if you look at genetic ancestry. There were a whopping 42 million Europeans who came over, predominantly from Western Europe. 80% of the European immigrants to the United States came from Western Europe, the minority from Eastern Europe. Genetically, we've seen that 60% of Western Europe is in this branch we call R1B that ultimately comes from Central Asia, breaks off from Central Asia around 900 to 1000 AD. Well, I bring this up because that means George Armstrong Custer and his men, each of them have a 60% chance of being in this branch. We could say with fairly high confidence that probably 60% of them were in this branch, just based on probabilities and today's distribution of this. Well, that's where R1B is found in this tree. What about Sitting Bull and his men? Well, up and down the Americas, virtually all of them belong, if they're not of European or obviously European or African descent, belong to this branch that we've called Group Q, the one that came over across the Bering Strait in the early AD era. Well, Group Q shows up right there. And if you say, well, that's not very far away from Group R1B, you'd be right. They're pretty close on the tree. They're right next to each other. So let's zoom in there. R1B and Q, and again, in this particular study, remember they looked mostly at Eastern Europeans, so that the size of the R1B branch is fairly small. R1B and Q are right there. They share a connection back there. And because we have a DNA clock that allows us to reconstruct a family tree, where the number of differences and identities represent the length of time by which people have been separated. If Ken and I have very few differences between us, we're close in the family tree. If there's many differences, we're far away. You can use all that to assign dates. These two groups share a common ancestor in 600 BC. And there's, again, some uncertainty. We're not exactly sure where Noah is. I can circle you on the tree. He's right around here, but if he's right there, that's still a matter we have to resolve. But around 600 BC is where these two groups share a common ancestor. You might say, what? so what? I guess that's more recent than what the mainstream folks say is 15,000 years ago. Well, hold on, we're not done with this yet. There are other European branches that we'll discuss in more detail in the future, especially when we talk about what happened to the Vikings. Europeans, Western Europeans in particular, show up in this R1B branch. They also show up in a branch down here. This is the branch that we call I, and in fact, it's found both in East and Western Europe. 60% of Western Europeans are found in this R1B branch, 20% in the I branch. So that means George Armstrong Custer's men, probably 60% of them were in the R1B branch, 20% of them were in this I branch, because they're heavily of Western European descent. These two branches share a common ancestor. Two modern European branches share a common ancestor in 1700 BC, 1,000 years earlier. So there's a good chance that when Armstrong got his army together, some of his men shared a very deep common ancestral connection, 1700 BC. And when they engaged the forces on the battlefield of Sitting Bull and his men, some of them would have shared a common connection in 600 BC. In other words, some of the so-called white Caucasians who were battling the red man, the different looking peoples, some of those US Army soldiers had a closer genealogical connection, at least in terms of genetics, a closer Y chromosome tree connection to the people they were fighting than the people they were fighting with. There were some of the members of Armstrong Custer's army who were more different from one another on this tree than they were from Sitting Bull. Yet they looked more similar to each other. They're Caucasians. They didn't look as similar to the Native Americans. But this is what modern genetics reveals, a shocking ancient connection between Native Americans and modern Europe. There are some modern Europeans, there are some Americans, me and Ken perhaps, who have a closer relationship on this tree to the Navajo, to the Sioux, to the Cheyenne, than we do to other Caucasians in the United States. It could be that Ken is in group I, that I am in group R1B, or vice versa, which means one of us is closer to the Native Americans than we are to each other. Yet Ken and I look like Caucasians. How is that? Ethnic change can happen much more quickly than we think. In episode 4, we saw that it's easy to take over another country. You can have a minority group that comes into a majority group. The minority group, due to basic genetic principles, will lose their ethnic features, so to speak, in their descendants. Yet they can, by their reproductive rates, be the dominant ancestors of these people. The reason I bring this up is because it allows us to now fill in some of the story of these Native American peoples. And it begins early in the ancient BC era. A group of Central Asian peoples arose. They lived for a couple thousand years. And at some point in the AD era, there was a group that broke away, migrated across the Bering Strait, and made their way into North America, dominated and took over. And again, even though they're separate branches on the tree, my impression is these Central Asian peoples are constantly intermixing. And so these Native Americans, today's Native Americans, broke away 200, 800 AD. Within 100 or a few hundred years, a second group of Central Asians broke away and moved into Europe. And over time, the next 500, 1,000 years, became the dominant ancestral group in Western Europe. These Western Europeans weren't content to stay for a variety of reasons, religious freedom, economic opportunity, and so forth. They kept moving westward, eventually arriving in the Americas, where these two Central Asian people groups, who share a long-standing ancient connection, met again. Not for the first time, but probably at least for the second. So even though these two groups of people looked very different, their ancestors were not far apart. Ethnic change can happen much faster than we think. Taking over a country is a lot easier than we think, episode 4. Our family trees are much more connected than we think, episode 2. The world is much smaller than we think. We're much more closely connected than we ever thought possible. This gives us now more narrative, more of a window into the story of today's Native Americans and the historical context in which they arose, lived, and persisted to this day. This is the new history of the human race. And in our next episode, we're going to try to get at this mysterious question of who the first Native Americans were and the story of their arrival and survival and perhaps extinction and disappearance from the world today.